welcome everyone. Thank you for joining. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Amanda Dundas. I'm a partner here at Org Vitality, and I am thrilled to be introducing today's discussion on creating a holistic listening program. With me today are Dr. Victoria Hendrickson, also a partner here at OV, as well as Amelia Wish, a director of project management. Both Victoria and Amelia work on some of our most complex client projects. So welcome, Victoria and Amelia. Before we get started, a few housekeeping tasks. I want to encourage anyone to put any questions you might have either in the Q&A box or the chat. Q&A will go just to the panelists. Chat will be for everyone, so do whatever you are most comfortable with. Also, since we are a survey company, it's no surprise we do have a survey at the end of this webinar. Your feedback is important to us, so please take the time to fill it out. And now let's dive in. Victoria, let's start with you. When you say a holistic employee listening program, what do you mean exactly?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think people often use the term really broadly, but when we're talking about a holistic strategy, we're thinking beyond one survey or one measurement. We're thinking more broadly about a strategy to listen to your employees, understand key topics and events, and to drive meaningful organizational change. So what does that mean? One, it means we're looking forward, not just measuring what's happened in the past, but thinking ahead to our organizational strategic goals and considering what employee opinions or feedback would help us move the needle on those as we look to the year ahead. And that can be a lot of things, but instead of measuring all topics that might be important somewhere in the organization, we really want to focus. We want purpose-driven, targeted measurements that are going to help us hone in on what matters most in a way that resonates with our workforce. So these measurements should be really specific to what you're trying to do and how your folks work best. And these results should map into really clear actions where we need them. So what does that look like? A listening strategy can have any number of surveys, assessments, or even research projects with existing data that have a different focus. But a true listening strategy is going to ensure that each of these pieces really work together and that each of those measurements produces an insight that's going to inform and enhance the next one, and that these insights can be connected rather than standing alone. So in our minds, a holistic listening program is going to generate more value than the sum of each individual survey. That said, that's kind of a broad look at how we define it. But in terms of what it means in practice, Amelia, what does this look like for your clients? What are some of the typical components of the strategy?
So you're looking at some of the typical components of the listening strategy. One of the things to think about is not really about running each of these programs individually, but how they work together and integrating the learning from one to the other. The two most popular are the engagement survey and the pulse survey. Engagement surveys run once a year or once every 2 years, and they're followed up with a pulse survey that either dives in a little bit deeper into takeaways from the engagement survey, or if there is a topic that's become very important to organization, they'll run a pulse survey, and they often happen anywhere from 1 to 4 times a year. We've also seen a lot more folks integrate life cycle surveys, everything from onboarding, really following an employee from their first day through their first up to 9, 12 months in an organization, really making sure that they're set up for success, as well as exit surveys where we touch base with an employee a couple of weeks before their last day, really try to understand why is it that they're leaving an organization, to see if there's anything that could have been done differently, especially if it's a high-performing employee, what can change for future employees. And then we have all the development type of surveys. So we have 360s and 180s that happen once or every year, every other year. Many of our clients do a 360 and they follow up with a check-in 6 months later to see how an employee is doing and the actions that they've taken on their development, and help them really move the needle in areas that they needed, as well as team assessments. How can a team work more efficiently and work better together? Victoria, I see the benefit in doing all of these, each of these touch points. Why not do them all?
It's a great question. And every once in a while, we do have an organization that comes to us and wants to get them all off the ground at once. And I do love the enthusiasm. Surveys are what we do here, and it's a great idea, but I think it's important to have a targeted purpose for each touch point and make sure that each of these is going to support real effort rather than just adding more touch points, maybe because other organizations do, or maybe because your HRBPs, kind of read about the value of a new kind of touch point. So, why specifically? One thing we say to our clients is bandwidth. Each of these certainly has value, but why not jump into all of them at once? There's bandwidth, one, of the project team to get each of these off the ground in a really seamless way that's going to be a good user experience for the employees taking all of these touch points. And then there's the leaders acting on the data for each one of these. So, each of these can be super valuable, but the measurement is only as valuable as the action it's going to generate. So if your leaders are still too busy working on their action plans from maybe a census and a recent 360, it might not be the time to add a new pulse survey, even if maybe your survey team could get it off the ground. There won't be the energy to kind of digest the results and move it forward. It might make sense to wait a little bit or to see if you can collect the data another way. Over time, survey action fatigue can really mount and lead to a lack of commitment in these programs. So I would say it's better to go slow, add these as there's time and energy to get them off the ground, act on these, help employees see that their feedback is really leading to change. And then when there's really energy and enthusiasm, then you add the next one. And that can certainly take time. So I do want to reflect that it takes time. You often have leaders who are eager for data, but you want to do it right in order for it to lead to lasting action.
As I mentioned in the beginning, one of the things is not about really focusing on running each of these programs, but how they work together. Can you share some examples on how you've done this?
Yeah, absolutely. So, any of these can really be tied together to lead to insights that are greater than any one of the surveys. I think one of the most common examples is going to be the census survey and the exit survey results. So, let's say you take your census or engagement survey once a year, and then folks maybe take their exit survey a week or two after they leave the organization. So after an exit survey, we can group together all of the employees who maybe left for a similar reason, maybe all of the employees who left for career development reasons. Or we can also group together folks who are maybe leaving for your competitor. We can group together these folks based on their responses to the exit survey and see what did they say on the engagement survey maybe 6 months ago. Now, I don't mean looking at their results individually. We want to look at things in a group way to maintain confidentiality and also to build a statistically sound story. But if we group together all the folks who are leaving for your competitors and say, as a group, how did these folks score on your engagement survey, and maybe how are those patterns different than everyone else? That might start to tell us, like, what were those frustrations 6 months ago that if we'd known about, we could have gotten ahead of. That then gives us an intervention plan that we can start working on more broadly so that other folks don't have these same frustrations. Another example is census and onboarding. You can join those surveys together to see what experiences in an employee's onboarding maybe lead to greater satisfaction or greater getting up to speed 6 months down the road, or even tie the onboarding survey to performance data. What experiences in that onboarding period are helping folks get up to speed and perform even faster than their counterparts? The onboarding survey is great on its own, but without tying it to performance data or the census data, we wouldn't have that extra piece to kind of go that next step further. So these are just a couple of examples. I think it's best to look at an organization's individual pain points and figure out, where do we need to go that next step, and what couple of pieces can we put together to really understand where employees are at.
Do you think that they compete against each other?
A good question. Ideally not. I think if we can really work with the team and put this together in a thoughtful way, we don't want them to compete. But of course, there are situations where they can. So the measurements themselves really technically shouldn't compete. And that's not really where I worry about friction in these cases, but it's kind of a time in the day thing. So one, there's the survey team preparing each program. There's a lot that goes into putting each of these programs out in a way that's going to be really user friendly for each of your employees taking the survey, especially if some of these programs are new. There's a lot of work to be done, and the more measurements you spread yourself across, something's going to be lost. The other thing there is the managers acting on touch points. So the more touch points that are required to learn and act on, the more time is required, especially if some of these are new. So, I would say if you're worried about conflict between touch points, I would say start with the end in mind. Consider who's responsible for acting on each survey and what kind of support they have. Some surveys really are under the purview of a centralized group. So like an onboarding or exit, typically those are for HR or talent management. And so that wouldn't conflict as much with the kind of manager level survey action planning of a census. So those would be good to go at the same time, as long as you have the bandwidth to get the surveys out. I wouldn't worry about the action conflicting. Whereas if a leader has an engagement survey and a 360 to act on the same time, that could be a little overwhelming. If they have a lot of HR support or a coach, that might be okay. But those are just the things I would look into. How many things is one group acting on, and who's helping them out?
What's the best starting point? Is it always the engagement survey?
It often is. So it doesn't have to be. And we can talk in a minute about examples where maybe it might not be the engagement survey, but I would say it is kind of often the default that it's the engagement survey. And when we say engagement survey, that might also be labeled as the census survey or strategic survey. But one of the great things about the census survey is it covers a lot of ground. It's often the centerpiece of a listening program because it tends to cover all employees. It covers a range of topics, and it generates conversation and action across an organization through all manager groups. So, if you want to start, kind of in one place and cover a lot of ground, often that is the census. And often if there is one place to start that leaders are familiar with, they're familiar with having an engagement survey. So it's an easy place to get started to find out where you might then want to dig in more. That said, if there's a really specific need for a measurement like a targeted pulse or life cycle program, then that would be the place to start. In the couple of times I've seen someone start with something other than the engagement survey, sometimes it's in smaller organizations where they don't need surveys to talk to or hear from every employee. There is more, kind of walking around or town halls, but maybe they focus on 360s to help leaders, kind of grow quickly. So in those small organizations growing quickly, I would say 360s often get them a little bit more bang for their buck in those early days.
At OV, we talk a lot about the idea of what's keeping a CEO up late at night as a starting point when thinking about designing an employee survey. Can you talk a little bit about why this is important? How do you figure out what's that one thing that's keeping that CEO up late at night?
Yeah, this is really important. And often organizations will come to us with a really quick timeline and they want to skip this step. Whenever possible, we really don't want to skip this step. This is one of the most important steps to make sure we're asking the right things on the survey, and also to make sure we're getting that leadership buy-in from the very beginning, because we know that's going to be really important for this to be a lasting program. So, the reason for this is we want the survey to be strategic and tap into the unique aspects of a company's culture and workforce. So in order for us to do that, we need to ask about the company direction, values, what differentiates you, and not just what differentiates you today, but what is going to differentiate you in a year, 5, 10 years. And that's something that often really does come from the CEO because that's what's on their plate at the moment. So, instead of ending up with a really generic survey, which gets you generic results, if we can, we like to talk to the CEO. So my preference is, kind of the very first step in building an engagement survey is an executive interview to chat with the CEO and ask them what keeps them up at night, where are we headed, what What are those obstacles? And what do you want to know from employees that would help inform your decisions? If you could snap your fingers, what do you want to know from everyone? And the CEO usually has that answer, pretty ready to go. And then of course we take that and write the survey questions and think about it. But that initial executive interview can really go a long way. If we can't talk to the CEO, discussions with other leaders or strategic documents can help us. But kind of the more we can get their vision for where we're headed, the more we're going to get a strategic survey that's going to tap into what's most important and build their commitment to making sure that this is a lasting program. So, I would say that's what's common. That's what we like to do. The engagement survey can be really popular, but I would say pulse surveys are next in popularity, and we see those coming up really frequently. Amelia, what do these look like for your clients, and how are they different from the engagement survey?
So many of our clients do a follow-up pulse survey based on the results of their engagement survey, what bubbled up to the top, where an organization has decided that they're going to take some action, to see now that they've started to take some action, what progress they have made, or to dive a little bit deeper and maybe to some topic that has come up after the engagement survey that they didn't cover in the engagement survey. We've had clients that have run a variety of different pulse surveys, culture, really checking in on values, work environment, communication. I had one client that was having a lot of questions around their internal communication, so that they would run a pulse with a random group of employees whenever they sent out an internal communication to just get some initial feedback on, how they're doing and if it's, improved or better than the previous ones. Wellness and well-being are also very popular. How stress, work life, there's a lot of things going on, and how is an organization really helping them manage everything. Trust in leaderships, how employees perceive the leadership, trustworthiness, vision, approachability. Diversity and inclusion has been very, very popular topics over the past couple of years, assessing how inclusive the workplace is, how inclusive a team is, focusing on things like fairness and belonging. Pulse surveys are also not always done at the organization level. Sometimes it's something within a group or a department, or a follow-up on the engagement survey with that group or department. Maybe their results were a little bit different than the overall organization, so just tapping into that a little bit more. One thing, I have a question for you, Victoria, is if you have a history of census surveys and you want to add a pulse and you've never had it before, how do you really determine which items to include?
It's a good question, and often we fill up those few slots on a pulse survey really quickly. There's a lot of possible content to put there. So I like to prioritize action areas and anything new. So the way to start there is going back to the most recent census survey and selecting the items that were key in action planning. So, how do we define that? That might mean the enterprise-wide action focus areas. If the company is working on 3 things, we want to put those 3 things on the pulse. If action planning is a little bit more distributed, we want to choose maybe the items that are most frequently selected by managers to work on. So like in our action tool, managers can note which items they're going to work on and what they're going to do. So we would go in there and figure out what are those most common areas that folks are working on, and we would add those to the pulse. What we want to do is we want to repeat those questions so that we can get a sense if folks are making a dent on their action plans or whether they need a course correction. The other place I like to look at is what's new. That might mean an item about a new strategy you want to measure, or if there's something out in the water in the world that we just need a little, check on. So that was really common in the early days of COVID. Folks wanted to check in on how people are doing, what their work arrangement preferences were. We even saw things like vaccination sentiment, just stuff that was really new that organizations needed data in order to make plans. I guess most recently we've seen that with like some return to office mandates. So who knows what it'll be next year and the year beyond that. But I think the pulse is a great place to put those kind of just in time topics. especially if maybe you don't have room for those just-in-time topics on your survey, on your census survey. You need to keep that consistent. A pulse can be a great way to collect that. There's other good reasons for other things to end up on a pulse. Most usually include an engagement dimension, but between those things, that kind of takes up the pulse pretty quickly.
We've talked about engagement and pulse surveys. Let's shift gears to life cycle surveys. Do life cycle surveys ever stand alone? What role do they play?
It's a good question. And, when we say life cycle, I will, first kind of preface most life cycle surveys are onboarding and exit. They're different points that an employee is experiencing, but it can also include things like a new role, a new manager. Some folks do like a stay life cycle touch point when someone's been there about a year. So this will kind of apply to all of those, although it's most frequently onboarding and exit. In terms of whether it stands alone or is part of something bigger, it can really go either way depending on purpose and depending on the organization's history of listening. What we see most often is that those life cycle surveys, especially the onboarding or exit, but candidate or kind of new manager as well, they're usually part of a larger program, including something like a census. And usually what happens is based on what happens in the census, we kind of figure out what part of the life cycle do we need to know more about, and then that's how the life cycle touch points get added. That said, I think if an organization is having issues with a particular life cycle moment, having a focus on what that life cycle moment is, can certainly take precedence. So before you kind of roll it out enterprise wide, it might make sense to start like where in the organization there's an issue. So if you have a particular job type that's really important for the success of your organization, maybe you start an onboarding survey with those folks in order to understand how they're coming up to speed, what the early days of their role are like, so that we can make sure that onboarding is really successful. And then as we, kind of feel more comfortable with the mechanics of that onboarding program, we can roll it out more broadly. So we've definitely seen that. If there is, kind of somewhere to focus first, great, focus there. And then we learn from that pilot or that, beginning of the program before we roll it out enterprise wide. I think that's especially important in organizations where the mechanics of getting folks a life cycle survey might be harder. If people don't have an email address, if you need to pull folks from the manufacturing floor for an onboarding survey, maybe don't start globally all at once until you have those mechanics really down and you know how to support them through the process. Learn with one part of the organization where you need the data and then spread that. So either way, kind of depends what's happening in the organization and that bandwidth. I keep using onboarding and exit as examples, but Amelia, I know you and your team have done some more unique life cycle kinds of touch points. Which ones stand out to you?
I think some of the interesting ones has been the closed loop survey. So really early on when an employee starts in the organization, we have some folks that ask some very basic questions. Did you get all your training? Did you get your paperwork? Are you fully set up with everything you need? Should that employee answer no to any of those questions, either their manager and HR gets an email immediately saying, so-and-so has not received training for X, Y, and Z, please help them set up, or they may not know how to do it. We also have manager follow-up. So it's not really just about the employee onboarding, but the quality of hire and has that employee met that manager's expectations for that role. And I think one of the more interesting things too is we have some folks that do an early or mini 360, and we'll talk about 360s in a second, but within the first 6-9 months, really helping that employee develop and know the skills that they need to develop in order to succeed within the organization. And sometimes it's just feedback from that the 360 is themselves and their manager, and that's really the comparison that they need that'll help them succeed in an organization. So I find those to be very interesting. I will shift, since I talked a little bit about 360s, to upward feedback. So we have, as another staple with many of our clients, is a 360. They run either monthly or quarterly or on an as needed basis for each employee. The 360 really provides holistic feedback for that employee from various stakeholders, and it helps them focus on their strengths and blind spots. We work closely with our clients and their competency models to help them develop their items. Often, many of our clients have multiple survey versions, really depending on their different management levels, so that employee is getting feedback that's very relevant to the position that they're in or in that management level within that organization. Often our clients say, somebody can repeat a 360 within a year or 2 years, but many are doing a developmental check-in, so that after 6 months, when they've completed a survey, an employee can go in and select, these are the X amount areas that I decided that I was going to focus on based on the results from my 360, and I want to see what progress I'm making. And once they select that, we send up a follow-up survey to either their same stakeholders, if that makes sense, or they can select a new group of folks if they've changed positions with the organization. But they'll get feedback on those specific areas, how they're doing, if they've made progress, or if they need to continue working with some open ends that'll give them a little bit more commentary around what it is that people are seeing or experiencing. Similar to the 360, we have 180 that is slightly more streamlined and is really getting feedback from somebody's direct reports. And it really helps them develop and hone in on maybe their management style or get feedback on how they're managing their group. Victoria, how do you see that these fit into the larger employee survey program?
Yeah, it's a good question. And we see often in organizations that do surveys and upward feedback, some, emphasize one over the other. Most of the surveys we've talked about so far are geared towards the organization as a whole. The assessments you're talking about with the upward feedback are really helpful to identify how the leaders responsible for key activity across the organization can improve. So, what specifically do they need to do to help the whole organization reach the kind of goals that we talk about on things like the census survey? So, I think both pieces of the puzzle are important and can fit together in a number of ways. I think the key is making sure that you have some method to measure those key leadership expectations across levels of the organization. So, as you said, there are different kinds of 360s, 180s, different ways we can capture this. It's not that everyone needs a 360. That might weigh down the system a little bit. It might mean you do 360s for all of your executives or folks who are new to an executive role. And maybe there are some, 180s for folks who have had unique development experiences. Maybe you have manager questions on the census survey for all other levels of leadership. Each of these are examples. The point is just there are different ways to ask about these leadership expectations, but we want to make sure that there is somewhere to kind of catch that for each level of leadership every couple of years at least. As you said, not everybody needs a 360 every year. Might be every 2 years, but somewhat regularly we want to make sure we capture this. Different ways to carve it up, but my main advice is to make sure you have coverage across the program. But in the same vein, not too much. If it's certainly on your census, then you might not need a 180 and a 360 as well. Covering it about once a year for most folks, I think goes pretty well.
How do you make these surveys part of your overarching listening strategy?
Yeah, part of it is, starting with the leadership competencies. I think where we see that this is most successful is organizations who have spent time to develop a really good competency model. And when I say a really good competency model, one that is specific for their organization, might be differentiated across different levels. What we expect in terms of behaviors from a C-level executive is probably different than a director level and a line level manager. So we want to have, clear behaviors that come out of competencies for each of those levels. And what's great about, a competency model like that is we can have that consistent across our listening strategy. So those competencies should inform behavioral statements on a 360 or 180. They should also inform your census survey. It might also inform an onboarding survey that goes to executives. The more we can be consistent across each of these, we can kind of tie together unique findings and also pull together really helpful resources to help folks understand and act on whatever the messages are coming out of those measurements. So, I would say if you're starting with any of this, start with your competency model, because that's really the building blocks for the rest of this. I've seen organizations that have tried to kind of skip that step and move a little faster, and you might have touch points that are initially helpful, and they can be helpful for individual leaders that need to make behavioral change. But you're going to see less of that kind of overarching connection and building those blocks over time. So the competencies are the main thing. I would say, other ways to make it part of the overarching listening strategy are identifying the right triggers to get these upward feedback assessments. It is tempting to often say, everyone gets a 360 or everyone gets a 180. We certainly want people to have information to act on, but often we don't have enough support in the organization for everyone to go through these assessments at the same time. So, is there a trigger like, new to the executive role, or, having been in an executive role for a certain amount of time, that means that folks then get these assessments. That way we don't have everyone going through at the same time. We don't want everyone going through at the same time, one, because mechanically that can cause rater fatigue on the folks that are rating all of these people. As well as on the back end, once everyone gets results, they might all need support at the same time. So, it's usually better if we can stagger them a bit. So if we can stagger them by activity, by going through leadership development, whatever seems right for your organization, identifying triggers, and again, being consistent with those. I think consistency is also really helpful so that people know what to expect. There are annual cycles for things like budgeting and action planning, and adding this kind of measurement in there is really helpful so that it's just something that happens in the organization, and people tend to accept and expect it that way.
So we've talked about upward feedback. Let's shift a little bit to team assessment, which we've seen a lot of interest in as of late. They typically run on an ad hoc basis, really to help a team identify where they're excelling and where there's areas of opportunities. They're becoming more important to our clients. HR works closely with a team leader or a team to make sure that the team is working effectively and focused on the organization's priorities. Many of our clients run an initial team assessment and then follow up soon thereafter to see how and if they're making progress and working to ensure that they're working together more positively. Clients tend to cover a variety of different topics in these team assessments, and it's really what that team is going to need and the information that they need to excel, to work together. There's performance-based assessments. Are they agreeing to priorities? Are they sharing team strategy? Team dynamics. Do they understand work styles? Do they appreciate what each team member brings to the organization? Creativity. Are they encouraging new ideas, open to risk-taking? How are their problem-solving approaches? Feedback and recognition, what's the frequency and quality of the feedback that the team is getting, receiving, giving each other, and recognitions of individual as well as the team. We've also seen inclusion included often. How inclusive is this team? Is everyone included and working together? Victoria, we've gone through several touch points. What are the important things to think about as our project teams are working with their organization's listening strategies?
Yeah. I think we've got a good final checklist here for folks to think through, and the answers here will certainly point organizations in different directions. And that's kind of the point. We want you to have a unique strategy for your unique organization. The first place to start is really your action goals, starting with the end in mind. We talked a little bit about when different touch points can compete, and often that's if the group to act on both of the touch points is the same. So, when you're planning out your listening strategy, whether you're looking across a year or 2 years, when you identify each touch point or possible measurement need, I would say think about what is the action assignment. Is it generating a new action plan? Is it checking in on an existing action plan? So what is someone supposed to do, and who? Is it managers at large? Is it a centralized group? And then based on sort of who it is and what they're supposed to do, what's the bandwidth like? We don't want to put too much on managers in maybe a two or 3 month period. We want to spread out their action planning requirements throughout a year. And we maybe want to try to align that with other times of year that they might be, goal setting or planning in some way. So if we're talking about more centralized groups, sometimes there's a little more flexibility, but we'd want to plan around their busy time of year. We don't want to saddle HR with, what are the new exit results like right before open enrollment? Let's do that earlier in the year. So really just look at the bandwidth of each group, and then, with that, maybe what support do they have? We do find that like the way to mitigate some of this lack of bandwidth can be additional support, usually at the leadership or executive level. If they're able to bring other folks in on the action planning or get some more support from centralized groups, sometimes we can kind of augment their bandwidth a little bit. But if we can't create action, we don't want to add the touch point. So start with what your action goals are and where you expect that to come from. On the complete other end of kind of survey planning, I would say workforce composition. So as you're looking at different touch points you want to get out throughout the year, or different things you want to know from employees, be realistic with how easy is it to survey folks. If you're at an organization where all of your employees are in front of a computer with a company email address, that's a huge step forward. You're one of the lucky ones. That doesn't mean there won't be other challenges, but that's a great place to start, and it might be a little bit easier. If you have folks on the manufacturing floor out in the field, we still really need to hear from them, but the mechanics in getting to them are going to be more challenging and might take more time. All of that's fine, but maybe less, or you might need more time between touch points, or you might need a greater lead up into some of the bigger touch points with those. Translations are another thing, accessibility concerns. All of these are really important to make sure every employee has a voice. But those things take time and really need to be considered into what is going to be a realistic program to pull off. Amelia, do you have examples of kind of creative ways of getting surveys to folks, or unusual mechanics to think through?
Thankfully, we've come a long way, and there's QR codes, which is everyone's best friend. We have so many clients that have folks in warehouses, distribution centers, putting up posters that are easily accessible by everyone, giving them time during their breaks to be able to complete surveys, providing them with laptops often. Not everybody has a phone that they can take a picture with a QR code, but maybe providing iPads, laptops in their break centers with the link so that somebody can go in and take the survey, but making sure that they have the time to be able to do that. Those are some of the basic things. We even have one company that hands out the links on paper so that the employee can do it when they have the time to do it at a later date. Not as favorable because there's a lot of printing. Again, QR codes go a long way, and some posters put up throughout the distribution center. But again, just making sure that folks have access to the link so that they can provide their feedback and be heard.
Yeah, all really good examples. We'll find a way to get the survey to folks. Okay. Yeah. Another thing we think about often is survey history. So, some organizations have been surveying for decades and they have an existing program. Employees kind of know when it's going to show up. and are really accustomed to it. Other organizations are much earlier in that journey. And I think, both are great places to be, but certainly impact how quickly you might add other touch points and kind of how agile you can be about changing that strategy. So, if your history with surveys is long, one, that's great. Employees are used to taking the survey. And the other point of that is, assuming it's generally a pretty good history with surveys. And when I say good, the main thing we're looking for there is it kind of a trustworthy experience? Do employees generally feel like their feedback is confidential? It leads to good conversations, et cetera. Most places that have a really long survey history, it's also a good history. And so we're saying, employees are used to this. It's generally then fairly easy in terms of employee trust to kind of add one more touch point because folks are used to taking surveys and it being a good experience. If there are pockets where maybe it hasn't been a great experience, maybe there's a leader who was well-intentioned, but didn't take confidentiality as seriously as needed, or something like that, we want to tread a little lightly. We want to go slower, and we want to build trust with the experience. We don't want to add as many surveys at once. We want employees to see that their feedback is confidential. It's going to lead to good conversations, et cetera. So, just be aware if there are pockets in your organization where maybe the history hasn't been great. That's a place to just go a little bit slower. Also, if surveys are very new to the organization, also go slower. Rather than adding all of the touch points at once, let's first show employees how carefully their feedback is treated and that it's going to lead to those good conversations before we ask them to give even more of their time for more feedback. Amelia, in your experience, what does this variation in survey history look like, or what does it look like with a kind of brand new program?
So one of the interesting things that at least I went through, or we went through, was we had a client who had a long history of doing an annual survey, but their annual survey was somewhere between 80 to 90 questions. And they came to us and they were like, we need a little bit of help. We want to get this down to 40 questions. How can you help us do this? We've had all of these questions for so many years. And so we interviewed the CEO, we interviewed their senior executives, really, again, going back to what's keeping them up at night, what are their priorities, what's the most important takeaways that they'll get from this type of survey that'll help them drive action within the company. We worked closely with them and we got it down to, I think, somewhere between 40 and 50 questions. And again, they had great feedback, but the most interesting thing, that was that first year. The second year, we saw a little bit better feedback, not that their scores improved, but some difference from the previous survey. So people weren't just clicking through to kind of get through the survey because there were so many questions, and some really great comments back from them. So again, things that they were able to take away and drive more action and see areas that needed help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, amazing what cutting the survey almost in half can help with that kind of focus. Oh, that's great. One thing we've seen, and I know you'll be able to speak to this, Amelia, is the bandwidth of the survey team, has a big impact on this, and sort of what you can plan for throughout the year. Even if you're working with a vendor, there is a lot for the internal survey project team to do to make sure it's a really good experience for each of your employees that are participating in the program. What does this look like with your team, Amelia, and the clients you support?
So, I mean, we've really become an extension of our client team. We're here to support them from the beginning through the end and even afterwards. So after the survey is done, questions come up, they need answers to, they don't always have the time or the bandwidth to be able to do it. So we're really here to support our clients every step of the way, making sure that they have everything they need, they've reviewed, we make sure that they stay on their key milestones to be able to get that survey out in time. If maybe they don't have an in-house translation, we have a translation house that we work with and help facilitate that, and just help things, make sure that things keep moving along so that the timeline is met and just take a little bit off of their plate, really.
Yeah, I know we're all talking surveys and listening here, but often our clients have other parts of their job. We forget about that. They've got other work streams, other responsibilities. So to have us, take on a lot of that can help the program be a lot more effective.
Mhm.
And then, kind of the other here on the slide is unique considerations of your organization or what's going on in the world. That's going to vary for each one of you and, where we are in time. But, just kind of a point to step back and say, what else will impact the success of this survey program so that we can be realistic about planning what can we do really well this year. Um, so. So I think we'll pause here and ask Amanda what kinds of questions the audience has so far.
Yeah, so first of all, I want to say thank you to both of you for this really informative webinar full of really practical tips. I know I found it really helpful, and I'm sure many here did as well. We have a number of questions actually coming in through the Q&A, but I actually have one myself before I jump into those. Amelia, I'm kind of wondering if you might be able to share what was the most unusual survey that you have ever worked on, either in terms of content or method.
Yeah. So we talked a lot about the common ones. I think one of the most unusual ones for me was we had a very large multinational organization that came in and they were shifting their strategic direction. And the shift was happening in stages throughout the company. Not everybody was going through it at the same time. And it actually, within that, had 4 different stages from awareness to actually living this new strategic direction. And so we would go in, and it was more like a pulse survey, see a couple of times throughout the year where each group division was within their journey, and then report back and see if they were actually moving along. The internal team would help those areas that maybe needed to communicate more, make sure that people understood what the strategic direction was, and help them move along. And we did that for a couple of years because it was really important that everybody was on board and was living the new direction of the organization. That was interesting.
That's great. Thank you. All right, I'm going to turn to the Q&A now. Victoria, this first one might be better suited for you. Do you always need to involve the whole organization in a listening program?
That's a good question. So I'm going to get really nitty gritty here. So when we say involve the whole organization in a listening program, in any particular survey or touch point, we don't need to include everyone. But across the whole program or strategy, I would say we should. So I think some examples of where you wouldn't include everyone. The one that comes to mind first is going to be upward feedback, like a 180 or 360. Not everybody gets one. Not everyone needs one. Typically those are for specific levels of leaders as they go through particular milestones. So, we don't need every individual contributor taking the same 360 as your executives. We have different expectations of leadership from those folks. So, I think upward feedback in particular tends to be very focused on specific levels of the organization. In terms of surveys, we'll often see pulse surveys for maybe particular divisions would go through, as a whole. And that might be specific to the kind of action they're trying to drive or maybe recent changes they've seen. So they're in a context or have goals that are, specific to them. The whole organization doesn't share those. So we're going to, have a specific measurement to the group it applies to. The other, kind of time you might look at not everyone gets a survey or specific measurement is if you're doing research, which is a whole other, kind of survey that we didn't really talk about. Most of the surveys we've talked about today are, specific to driving action to, make the culture or make the way we do work better. You might have areas that you want to ask research only questions. So sometimes those might be about pay or benefits, or you might be considering changing questions on your survey, but you need to test it before you make that change and really put it on your census survey. So you might make it a research question where you're asking it of a subset of folks just to see how it performs statistically, and you're not giving those results to managers to discuss and act on. I think all of those things are perfectly fine. What is challenging is like, let's say you have a group of folks that are hard to survey. They're out in the oil field, or they're working on the shop floor and really don't get a lot of chances to come use smart devices. We don't want to exclude those folks as a population, because we want to make sure their voice is heard, especially if it is a really particular job type. We want to make sure we understand the unique concerns. So any one specific measurement, fine, but make sure they're somewhere in your listening strategy.
That's great. And we actually just got a question in the chat that I think kind of piggybacks a little bit on this. What are some of the best practices for handling listening strategies within a large enterprise that has several different business branches with unique needs? Does it make more sense to have one strategy for the entire enterprise, or separate strategies for each business sector?
I'll jump in there and then curious what Amelia would add. I would say both can be effective. The turning point on sort of which of those to kind of go down as sort of the main path is going to be based on your organizational strategy. So organizationally, do you act as one company, one enterprise, and you have all these different divisions that support it? So like, is there a common leadership team? If so, we want to have one enterprise listening strategy. Now, underneath that, sure, have branching, have supplements, you might have some customization, but it is under one strategy. If, on the other hand, you say, it's kind of just a holding company, each of these divisions really acts as their own company, they might have different listening strategies. That would require a lot more bandwidth as well on the internal listening team.
No, I agree with, yep, I agree with what you said. And I was just trying to think, I mean, I remember there was one company that was merging, and so they had their overarching listening strategy, but then they did have some branching and supplements that went off to those that were new members of this organization, really to diving deep on how they were feeling and were they really seeing it. So again, it was still the one strategy, but making sure that they were getting feedback from those new folks within the organization.
Yeah. And I would say, if you go that direction where you do have the one strategy, but you want to make sure all feel heard, which I think is probably most common in this case, there are a lot of things you can do to, within one strategy, still have some differentiation. Amelia, you mentioned branching and supplements. So maybe each of these divisions gets 5 specific questions to them. Also, it might be that they have a common census survey, but maybe they do different pulses throughout the year, depending on, kind of like what's their busy time and what are those topics that are going to be most critical. That could look totally different across your different divisions, but it has a common goal of we're, getting at their action ideas or what's most important to them. They also might have different life cycle moments. So I think those are ways where you could kind of customize, but have one strategy that you're executing on.
Okay, we probably have time for a couple more questions, so please continue to put them into the Q&A. If we don't get to them here, we'll follow up with you after. Here's another question that came in saying, of all the different touch points or surveys, which is the most effective, and how do you know where to focus?
Probably engagement or census, without knowing much more about the specific organization. And that's just because it does cover such a wide range of topics. You're more likely to come up with meaningful action ideas there than any one on its own. So yeah, I would say that the engagement or census survey covers such a wide range in terms of both topics as well as folks who are going to receive a report and be expected to, lead a conversation to start some action. So that wide swath is probably going to get you the most bang for your buck. How do you know where to focus? I hate to be sort of the consultant that says it depends, but it does. It depends on your organization, what's important, what are your pain points. That's where you focus. We can certainly help you try to figure out where that is and prioritize. But it's usually not, what's the most popular HR topic these days. It's what are the pain points? What makes it hard for an employee to do their job day to day?
Thank you. How important are norms for each of the different types of surveys that you discussed in the webinar today?
Norms. So the more unique any of these surveys are going to be, the harder it's going to be to give you norms. I would say norms are usually most useful with that engagement or census survey, where there is going to be a really wide range of topics, and some of those are going to be more generic. Engagement as a dimension, career, things like that. It's usually easy to compile some norms, and that also helps the leadership level of an organization understand what's a good score, what's typical, and set some goals there. Where it's less important is going to be somewhere like upward feedback. And I will qualify that I'm talking about external norms. When we look at upward feedback, usually those instruments are based on your specific competencies. Those should be very specific to your organization. Hopefully not everyone has the same competencies. And so again, the more specific those are, it's hard to find external norms, but in those cases, internal norms can be really helpful. So maybe there's an internal norm of, each level, what's a typical score? And that again helps people know, are they on target? Are they above average, et cetera? Really unique pulses, like when we were in the middle of COVID and, people wanted to ask about work arrangement preferences. I mean, there's no norm. We were all in the middle of it. It's brand new. Like there's no norm. It's brand new. And so any super new topic like that, norms just aren't as helpful.
Thank you. This seems somewhat related, this question, so I'm going to jump to it. Do all these surveys need trend?
Short answer is no. Trend is useful when the best comparison is, where was I last year? And so that's going to be great for census or pulse surveys. Amelia, what do you see with upward feedback?
We don't typically have trend. That the trend really is more in the developmental check-in for employees, where they're taking the areas that they wanted to focus on and asking, have I moved the needle? Do I still need to do work? So it's less about trend. We do see trend in team assessments. Same exact questions, how, and the second time they take it, or even sometimes the third, we see a little bit more trend there.
Well, thank you both. Are there any last words of advice for our listeners?
If I just sum it up, I would say start with the end in mind. Think about the action you're trying to drive, and be really realistic about what you and your team can do for a great employee experience, and make it custom and unique to your organization and that action you're trying to drive.
Thank you. Amelia, any last words?
What's keeping your CEOs up at night?
Great place to end. Thank you, everyone. Again, really appreciate your time today. We will be sending out both a video and a deck. And as always, we are here. If you have any follow-up questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Bye.
Bye.